I want to start with a specific image that I keep coming back to whenever I think about how this whole thing began. My father's house, his study. A Tuesday afternoon in November, about 3 weeks after his funeral. I was there to collect some personal things, photographs mostly, a few books that had belonged to my grandmother, that he'd always said he wanted me to have eventually. My sister Carolyn was not there. She had a key, but she wasn't there that day, which mattered more than I knew at the time. I found the folder by accident. I was looking for a photograph I remembered sitting on the third shelf of the bookcase, a picture of my father and my mother at a holiday somewhere in the early 90s, and when I pulled a stack of books out to look behind them, a manila folder came with them and fell open on the floor. I almost just picked it up and put it back without looking. I'm going to spend some time in this story thinking about the moments where a small decision could have led to a completely different outcome. This was the first one. I looked at what had fallen out of the folder. It was a document, thick, legal-looking, with a firm's letterhead at the top and signature lines at the bottom. I recognized my father's signature on one of those lines. I recognized my sister's signature as a witness on another. I did not recognize the document itself. I sat down on the floor of my father's study with the folder in my lap, and I started reading. Before I tell you what the document said, I need to tell you about my father and about Carolyn, because understanding both of them is what made everything in this story possible. My father was a man who built things slowly and kept them for a long time. He had run a small civil engineering consultancy for 31 years. Not a large company, at its peak about 12 employees, but profitable and respected. The kind of business that exists because one person spent 3 decades being consistently reliable and good at what they did. He had sold the business about 8 years before he died, and the proceeds of that sale, combined with the family home and the investments he had made steadily over many years, represented a meaningful amount of money. He had made a will when my mother died, about 12 years before this story takes place. I knew this because he had told me. He had told both of us, me and Carolyn. The will was straightforward by his account. Everything split equally between his 2 children. He had said this more than once, in various contexts over the years, not in a formal declaration kind of way, just in the way that people reference facts they consider settled. He said it the way you'd say we're having dinner at 7, simply, without fanfare, because it wasn't complicated. My father had a stroke about 2 years before he died. He recovered significantly from the initial event, but it left him with what his doctors described as mild cognitive impairment. Not dementia. He knew who people were. He could hold a conversation. He remained largely himself in the ways that mattered. But he was slower to process new information. He sometimes struggled to track multiple things at once. He was, in the language that becomes relevant later in this story, potentially susceptible to undue influence. He lived alone after the stroke, initially, and then Carolyn moved back nearby and took on what I can only describe as the primary caregiver role. She drove him to appointments. She managed his household accounts. She was, from the outside, doing what a devoted daughter does for an aging father who needs more support than he used to need. I was further away, a different city, about 3 hours by train. I visited regularly. I called several times a week. I was not, however, present in the daily texture of my father's life in the way Carolyn was. That's simply true, and I think it's important to say it clearly rather than let it come out sideways later. What I didn't know, sitting on the floor of his study with that folder in my lap, was how much had been happening in the daily texture of my father's life that I hadn't been told about. The document was a deed of variation, for those who don't know what that is, and I didn't, not until I looked it up that evening. A deed of variation is a legal instrument that allows beneficiaries of a will to alter the terms of the will after the testator has died. It is a legitimate legal tool used, for instance, to redirect inheritance for tax purposes or to accommodate changed family circumstances. Except this deed of variation was dated 14 months before my father died, which meant it had been executed while he was still alive, and which meant it was not a deed of variation at all in the proper legal sense. It was something else, dressed in similar language. A document that had been constructed, whether by someone incompetent or by someone deliberately deceptive, to look like one thing while functioning as something entirely different. What it functioned as, when I finally understood what I was reading, was a reassignment of the primary asset in my father's estate. The family home, the house I was sitting in, the house my parents had bought together and lived in for 38 years, and where Carolyn and I had grown up, was, according to this document, no longer part of the estate to be divided equally. According to this document, it had been transferred to Carolyn's name, solely, as a gift, the document said, in recognition of her care and support, signed by my father, witnessed by Carolyn herself, which I would later find out was legally problematic in a way that would become important. I sat on the floor for a very long time. I did not call Carolyn that night. I thought about it for a long time. I went back to my own accommodation and sat with the document photographed on my phone and thought about all the ways that call could go. She would have an explanation, probably one she had prepared. She would say my father had wanted this. She would say she had sacrificed years of her life caring for him. She would say I hadn't been there, which was true in the factual sense even if it wasn't true in the way she would mean it. And the moment I called her, she would know I had found the document. She would have time to prepare. She would possibly have time to move assets, consult lawyers, build a narrative. All the things that become possible once the person on the other side understands that you know. So I didn't call her. Instead, I called a solicitor. Not just any solicitor. I spent about 2 hours that evening finding a firm that specifically handled contentious probate cases. When I explained the situation to the person I reached, I am going to call her Margaret because that's not her name. She asked me to come in as soon as possible and to bring everything I had. I went in the following morning. Margaret was precise and thorough, in a way I found enormously reassuring, given that I was sitting in her office feeling like I was being slowly turned upside down. She looked at the document for about 15 minutes without speaking. Then she asked me several questions about my father's condition at the time the document had been signed. She asked whether he had had independent legal advice in connection with the signing. She asked about the witness signature. When I told her that Carolyn had witnessed the document she was about to make herself sole beneficiary of, Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said that a beneficiary witnessing their own gift document was not simply irregular. It was, in most circumstances, enough to invalidate the document entirely. Over the following 3 months, Margaret and I, with the assistance of a barrister she brought in, partway through the process, built a picture of what had happened. What we found was considerably more than one document. There had been a series of changes to my father's financial arrangements over the approximately 18 months between his stroke and his death. Some were straightforward, account simplifications, the kind of administrative tidying that makes sense when someone's capacity to manage complexity has reduced. Others were less straightforward. We found evidence, through bank records obtained through the proper legal channels, that 2 significant sums had been transferred from my father's accounts to an account in Carolyn's name during this period. Not large enough individually to be immediately alarming, substantial enough together to matter considerably. We found, through the independent medical records of my father's GP, documentation of his cognitive status at the time the property document had been signed. The GP's notes from appointments around that period used language that, according to the barrister, would be relevant to any assessment of his capacity to understand and independently decide on a transaction of that nature. We found something else, something that, when Margaret showed it to me, made everything that had seemed complicated suddenly feel very clear. In my father's personal correspondence, physical letters and cards, the kind my father had kept out of habit throughout his life, there was a letter from him to me, undated but identifiable by context as having been written roughly a year before his death. He had never sent it. It had been folded and placed inside an old book in his study, the kind of place he sometimes kept things he hadn't decided what to do with. The letter was not about Carolyn specifically. It was not an accusation or a complaint or a formal declaration of anything. It was more like someone thinking out loud on paper, in the way my father sometimes did, but it contained one paragraph that I have read so many times since that I can reproduce it almost word for word. He wrote that he had been worrying lately, that he had done something he didn't fully understand, that Carolyn had brought him papers he hadn't had the chance to read properly, that she had said it was just administrative, something about the house, that his solicitor had prepared it, and he had trusted her and signed. He wrote that he wasn't sure now whether that had been right, and that he kept meaning to ask someone about it but finding reasons not to. He had never sent the letter. He had never asked someone about it. And Carolyn had walked away with a house. About 4 months into this process, Carolyn called me. She had been calling periodically since the funeral, in a way that, in retrospect, I understand as monitoring, checking what I knew and what I was doing without asking directly. Each call had been warm, sisterly, full of references to how hard the grief was and how important it was for us to support each other. I had matched her register without giving her anything. This call was different. She had been contacted by my father's original solicitor, the firm that had handled his will when my mother died, who had reached out in connection with some probate administration query. And in that conversation, something had been mentioned that had made Carolyn understand, I think, that there were questions in the air that she hadn't fully anticipated. She asked me, on the phone, in a voice that was doing a great deal of work to sound casual, whether I had been to the house recently. I told her yes, I had collected some things. She asked whether I had found everything I was looking for. I said I had. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want you to know that everything with the house was Dad's decision, that he asked me to do it, that I have done nothing wrong. I told her I appreciated her saying that. I told her I was sure we would have a chance to talk through everything in due course. I told her I had to go because I had something on the stove. I hung up and called Margaret. The formal challenge to the property document was filed approximately 5 months after I found the folder on the floor of my father's study. The grounds were multiple: the witnessing irregularity, the question of my father's capacity at the time of signing, the absence of independent legal advice, and what the barrister described as the overall circumstances giving rise to a presumption of undue influence given the caregiving relationship between Carolyn and my father at the relevant time. Carolyn contested it. I want to be honest that I had not expected her to roll over. She never had been someone who conceded easily, even in situations where concession was the obviously correct response. She had solicitors of her own by this point, and they put forward her account of events, which was that my father had independently decided to gift her the house, that she had merely assisted with the administrative process of documenting it, and that his signing of the document had been entirely voluntary and fully understood. The letter in the book dismantled that account fairly thoroughly. Handwriting analysis confirmed it was my father's. The context established the timeline, and its contents, the specific reference to papers being brought to him, to not having the chance to read them properly, to her telling him it was administrative, were simply too specific and too internally consistent to be explained away. The case did not go to full trial. Carolyn's legal team, having seen the full body of evidence assembled, recommended a settlement. The discussions took about 6 weeks. The outcome was that the property document was voided. The house reverted to the estate. The estate was administered according to the original will, which meant equal division between 2 beneficiaries. The 2 account transfers were treated as advances against Carolyn's share of the estate and deducted accordingly. My father's wishes, as he had stated them to both of us more times than either of us could count, everything split equally between his 2 children, were ultimately what happened. I don't speak to Carolyn anymore. I want to say that simply, without making it sound more dramatic than it is. I don't speak to her because I don't know what I would say, not because of the money, though the money was real and the legal process was expensive and exhausting in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, but because of my father's letter sitting in that book for what must have been close to a year. He had been worried. He had written it down in the specific way he used to think, through things that troubled him. He had kept meaning to ask someone about it, and found reasons not to. I think the reason he didn't ask is the same reason these things usually go unaddressed until it's too late, because asking would have meant confronting the possibility that someone he loved had done something deliberate to him, because at 81, recovering from a stroke, increasingly dependent on the person he was suspicious of, the cost of that confrontation was too high to pay voluntarily. He had trusted her because she was his daughter. That trust was the thing she used. Here is what I want you to take from this story if you take anything. If you have an aging parent whose affairs are being managed primarily by one family member, get involved. Not with suspicion, not with accusations, just with presence. Ask questions, attend appointments, read documents before they are signed. The specific vulnerability that makes these situations possible is not money, and it's not greed, and it's not even a particular kind of family. It's the combination of dependence and trust, and the person in a caregiving position who understands that the most powerful tool available to them is the fact that it is very hard to be suspicious of someone who is helping you. My father deserved better than to die without knowing whether what he had signed had been right. I could not give him that, but I could make sure that what he had actually wanted, in the end, was what happened. That is something. That's karma filed. Real family, real documents, real quiet manipulation, exposed by a letter that was never sent. If this story got to you, and I think it will, if you have ever watched someone you love be made vulnerable by the people around them, you know what to do. Subscribe, hit the bell, and tell me in the comments whether you have ever discovered something like this in your own family. I read every single one. I'll see you in the next video.